Our first speaker today is Dr. Andrew Redden, who is a senior lecturer in Latin American history at the University of Liverpool, as well as a trustee in the UK support team for Music for Hope, which is a charity that teaches music to young people in rural El Salvador and offers a safe and neutral place in which they can grow and form long-lasting friendships away from the gang violence that devastates the country. And Andrew's academic career began by focusing on colonial religious history of Spanish America. And since 2013, he's been traveling regularly to El Salvador, apart from more recently, obviously, because of the pandemic. But he's been recording the work of Music for Hope, which has been done by musicians and young people in the communities. And he's also been delivering workshops in storytelling and songwriting. And so he's going to talk to us about silence and activism-based research in El Salvador, the case for Music for Hope. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Pablo, for that introduction. That actually saves me saying some of the things that I was going to say, because as by way of context. There's quite a lot that I wanted to put in here, and I've only got 10 minutes, so I'm not sure I'll be able to do it. But the key thing is that what I wanted to say was this is a story of two young people from one of the communities in which Music for Hope works, and how their lives were dramatically affected by an attack by a death squad on their community. But there's also a reflexive element in there, which is my relationship to those young people as well. The two young people, to protect their anonymity, I'm going to call them Elias and Leandro. And both were part of the Music for Hope project that Pablo mentioned. I've put the links for Music for Hope in the chat as well. I first met Elias in 2013. Well, I first met both of these, Elias and Leandro, in 2013, when I went out as a volunteer for Music for Hope to record what the project was doing, to bring back information, videos, photographs for the people that were donating to the project back in the UK. Again, there's a link to some of those videos that I've produced then and since in the chat. Elias at the time was 13. He was a really talented musician. He was a bass player, but also quite good at other musical instruments. After that, he was sponsored by Music for Hope to do an advanced musical training course with the hope that he might go on to become a teacher within the project. In the communities. Leandro, meanwhile, was one of the Music for Hope team in the communities and was responsible for the coordination of the project between the communities. So he moved between the communities, and he talked to different organizations about the project, and he also brought in new young people and children into the project. And as Pablo mentioned, the prime aim of the project was through music to give young people and children a safe, neutral space to learn life skills and form very close friendships away from the gang violence that was affecting the region so dramatically. With respect to the gang violence, these communities had managed through their own organization really to avoid the worst effects of the gang violence until about 2014, when the gangs took hold and the violence became particularly acute in 2015. My own position then changed within Music for Hope, because I took on a formal research project in discussion with the El Salvador team and also the UK team, which was to investigate and write the history of the project through collecting oral histories and recording the work that was still being done. And the first formal research trip I did to the communities was in 2016. Not long after I'd left, I visited the communities just a few months after. One of the communities, this is the village in which Leandro and Elias lived, was attacked by a death squad. And 5 people from the community were dragged from their homes, taken to the outskirts of the community and executed, murdered, essentially. The next day, the police, who knew the people that were murdered, they knew the victims, gave a press conference that basically said that the victims of the murders were all delinquents, and that the murders were it was an intra-gang dispute. All of this was a complete lie, but it was repeated by the press organizations that were there. It wasn't questioned. The people of the communities were too afraid to question it in public, and it was picked up by other news organizations and relayed on international websites. Now, this did have an impact on one of the people whose story I'm telling, which is Leandro later on, which I'll get to in a minute. So yeah, the lie that the police told was believed nationally and internationally. And it was a discourse that the police used that transformed the victims of a horrific murder into the perpetrators of imaginary crimes. And this allowed people to justify these murders as necessary, or at least inevitable, expected. So along the lines of, oh, well, they had it coming to them. What more could we expect? But there's a more sinister element to this. It allows the real crimes to go uninvestigated and therefore protects the real perpetrators. Now, there is a precedent, unfortunately, in El Salvador for death squads. So in the 1970s and 80s, death squads were illegal, but nevertheless formed an intrinsic part of the counterinsurgency operations that were carried out by the state against the rural poor. So what they focused on eliminating, exterminating those who are suspected of supporting the guerrilla forces, whether that support was logistical, political, or intellectual. But in 2015 and 16, death squads, still illegal, similarly formed an intrinsic part of so-called security operations against gangs, because what they did was they targeted young people that were rumored to be collaborating with the gangs. Now, collaboration is a complex issue that in many ways is unavoidable for the majority of people in the communities that are affected by the gangs, particularly for the families of those who have family members in the gangs themselves. Yeah, so death squads were used to cleanse, and that's a word used by a politician that I interviewed in 2016, cleanse the zone. He literally said, "Estamos limpiando la zona," when I asked him about security issues, and then caught himself when he saw the look on my face when he'd used the word limpiando, which is cleansing. The problem is that the police that operate legally need a warrant to make arrests, and in order for a warrant to be issued, they need evidence that the person that's suspected of a crime has committed a crime. The death squads, on the other hand, they kill those for whom there's no substantive evidence at all, and therefore they exterminate those young people deemed to be supporting enemies of the state. Now, there's a few points that I want to mention. These are initial thoughts about the death squads. First thing to mention is that the young people that are killed are almost exclusively from marginalized, if not extremely marginalized backgrounds. The press, the national press, is generally speaking sensationalist and uncritical. When those that are murdered are labeled by those outlets as delinquents or criminals, it basically provides cover for the real criminals who are carrying out the murders. Not all of those murdered are actively collaborating in gangs. So in 2016-17, there was a significant increase in proclamations by death squads that not only will they kill gang members, but they'll also kill their family members and all those who associate with them. It was that broad. So it's certainly the case, whilst one child or an adolescent might join a gang, his siblings or cousins might not, and yet they'd still come under scrutiny by those who are working with the death squads. And just as a very sinister note, last month, 2 political activists from the FMLN who had nothing to do with gangs at all, they were also assassinated by a security detail from the Ministry of Health. And that raised this really disturbing spectre of death squads, once again moving against activists who oppose the government. Now, another point, the youths that do collaborate might be doing for a number of reasons. They might be misguided or because they're being blackmailed. Nevertheless, they're still considered legitimate targets for extermination. Another point to mention is that given the clandestine nature of the death squads, the criteria for extermination is very uncertain. And there has been evidence that's come to light that they've actually been paid hits. People from the have paid the gangs to take out other people who they deem worthy of extermination. And the final point with regards to death squads is the issue of terror and the silence that it provokes. So what they do is they spread fear amongst the communities so that no one is able to mention them openly or speak against them for fear of being targeted themselves. So what that does is it undermines communal trust, as people don't know who's informing the death squads. And once strong and politically organized communities are effectively broken up and atomized into frightened nuclear families and individuals. So no one dares speak out against either the gangs or the death squads. And this directly benefits vested interests in the acquisition of material wealth and resources. Now, I've only got 2 minutes left. So just to kind of wrap up the stories, Elias was a member of a music group and one of his friends in the music group was one of the victims. Because he was one of the victims, the rest of the music group became guilty by association, and rumours of a hit list circulated amongst the communities. And the result of that was that 38 people had to flee the community, and it only had 400 people in it. So that's 10% of the population, for fear that they'd be next. So 26 of those were between the age of 5 and 30, 22 were between the ages of 11 and 30. So the hit list effectively attacked an entire demographic of young people. And Elias was one of those who had to flee, and he took the usual route to the United States, where 4 years later, his case is still going through the courts as an asylum case. Leandro, on the other hand, his situation was very different. He didn't think he would be in danger at all. But he was warned by someone in the capital that he was under investigation by a commando police force. And he was warned to get out of the country. So this is where I suppose a reflexive element comes in, because he contacted me in desperation, not knowing what to do, and we talked through the options, and in the end I bought him a ticket to the UK, where he claimed asylum, and I suppose this is, and whilst his asylum case was going on, he lived with me. We helped each other in many ways, but particularly I did what I could to help him with his asylum case, which eventually was successful, but it was turned down initially by the Home Office, because they believed the press reports and the police statement that all those killed by the death squads are delinquents, therefore why on earth would they be threatening somebody who wasn't a delinquent? They simply didn't understand that the state could persecute its own citizens through illegal or paramilitary organizations. So that's the story really, and it's a story for consideration. Just to wrap up, to mention with respect to activism and research, in the case of Elias, his activism within Music for Hope has ended. He can no longer work with Music for Hope, but the values that Music for Hope passed on haven't gone to waste. His compassion for others continues, because I visited him in the United States afterwards and saw how compassionate he was with homeless people, given his own circumstances in which he nearly ended up on the streets himself. Leandro, on the other hand, after his case was approved in the United Kingdom, was able to take on an active role within Music for Hope as an intermediary and coordinator between the two, the UK team and the El Salvador team. So he continues to work within the project, and that, I suppose, brings me on to the question, or the fact that the professional distance that most researchers have dissipated. I would argue necessarily, which means that there's an open question as how that has affected the research. It's a work still in progress, and any comments or feedback would be most welcome. So yes, I'll finish there. Thank you very much for your attention.